Thank you very much indeed, Gaynor, for that kind introduction. And thank you to both CCLA and London funders for organising this lecture and for inviting me to speak. It's obviously a great venue and a real privilege to speak here, and a terrific audience. There are some friends of mine here, and thanks very much for coming, but also people I don't know and hope to meet later, and I hope people can stay for a while afterwards. It's a real pleasure to be involved with both CCLA and London funders, but I particularly want to thank CCLA for their work in partnering with us for the Councillor Achievement Awards that celebrate the achievement of councillors. Now, these lectures are called the Powerful Ideas series, and I just want to pay tribute to CCLA themselves. They are innovators. They are people with some powerful ideas. I'm very interested in the potential of their public sector deposit fund to harness the benefits of cooperation between local authorities, and I hope you'll perhaps talk to Michael about that later. The powerful idea I want to discuss, though, is localism. I want to set out where localism comes from, what it means in the world that we live in, and by commenting on current reforms and setting out my ideas, I want to say how I believe that localism can help us to meet the challenges we face now and in the future. The LGRU exists to strengthen local democracy. We believe that power should be in the hands of citizens as far as possible. Now, we're not arguing for Athenian-style direct democracy or for Swiss-style local cantons or for American-style federalism or even for the French local mayor. We're arguing for something that we see as an evolution of the British tradition of local democracy. Some of you might raise your eyebrows at that. It's fashionable to lament the lack of localism in our system. But the powerful presence of government in our lives today means it's very easy to think it's always been like that, always been like this. Yet the centralisation and the concentration of power in Westminster and Downing Street is a relatively young arrangement in our country. The current government says it wants to give power back from the centre. We're encouraged to build a big society. Just think about that for a moment. Government telling us to build a big society. Shouldn't government come from society? Shouldn't it be for society and of society? Society should create government. Thomas Paine said, "Governments arise either out of the people or over the people." Society is born out of the idea that we do best when we work with others, when we understand that our interests are shared with others. Every society of people that we know anything at all about, stretching back over millennia, have organised their relationships with each other very much at a local level, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. Because any collection of people has to solve what we might call the problems of other people. That's how Jeff Mulgan puts it in his excellent book, Good and Bad Power. He identifies 5 main problems of other people. The first is the pressing threat of violence. Murder rates in most previous societies, in most times in history, have been far, far higher than they are today, and certainly in our country. Without the rule of law, though, without government, without a system of justice to keep the peace, some people will resort to violence in order to resolve the conflicts that they find living with other people. The second problem of other people is that there are always conflicting interests. We may want the same land. We may want the same goods. Your green belt is my new home. There's the problem of exploitation, the problem of freeloaders is something we often hear about. I think the modern expression of that is a concern that people have about fairness in society. Are people putting in what they take out of society? Are people paying their way and so on? Then there's the tragedies of the commons. And that's all about people overusing scarce resources and shared resources. We need systems in order to ensure that people get a fair and appropriate share of resources. And fifth, finally, there are situations where what is rational for one person becomes irrational for the community as a whole. Some of you will know about game theory. Some of you will have heard of the prisoner's dilemma. If I cheat and you don't, I might gain. If we both cheat, the chances are we'll both lose out. So we need to come together to resolve these problems and thousands of others. We need to be able to communicate, so often we might develop shared language. We need forms of exchange in order to trade, so we develop currencies. We might want to agree some rules in society that are convenient or about our safety. It's helpful if we all drive on the same side of the road. So to solve the problems of others, societies pool resources, they create community capital, they create rules. And when we do that, we can achieve a lot of that through dialogue, through voluntary arrangements, certainly through trade and through markets. But we also need government. And our history, British history, is a story of the evolution of democracy and government. Much of it that we learn about, much of it that we celebrate, is national. So from the Magna Carta to the Civil War to the Bill of Rights to the 1832 Reform Act. But actually much of our government and democracy has developed very much at a local level. You know, the English shires are one of the oldest systems of local government to have survived anywhere in the world. If you look at the Domesday Book, you can just about recognise a broad map of the shires as they are today. And our national government has traditionally, for 1,000 years, had a night watchman approach. For the economists amongst you, you know that the night watchman is a very limited form of government, concerned with limited to the collection of taxes to defend the realm and keep the king's peace, or the queen's peace for that matter. Now, I can't do justice to 1,000 years of local government history. Let's be honest, I'm sure you don't want me to, and I'm keen that you don't fall asleep. So let me fast forward you to the 19th century, when urbanisation and industrialisation created a really powerful impetus in towns and cities for local government reform. Guilds of merchants and craftsmen came together to regulate local commercial and economic affairs. Their practice of electing officials, of providing representation and accountability to members, found their way into local administration, into local government that became local democracy. Many of you will know that many of the town halls around Britain are guild halls. And those units of local administration, early local democracy, they formed turnpike trusts and improvement commissions for their area. And many of these were through local acts of parliament that were council-sponsored bills enacted by Parliament for the needs of a particular locality. Newcastle, for example, sponsored an Act of Parliament that allowed them to prohibit the building of houses that didn't have a privy attached to them. Councils in the Midlands originated laws to tackle animal cruelty. And many of these local laws became national laws over time. Examples are the powers over public health. So, for example, the 1848 Public Health Act enacted many of the things that were going on in communities around England to contain the spread of diseases like cholera and tuberculosis. So the legislative process was working as I believe it should. Communities originating legislation, government from communities, government by society. And over these years, a plethora of arrangements came to be in place, from library commissioners to commissioners of baths and warehouses, to burial boards and inspectors of lighting, to school boards and boards of guardians, and a whole range of arrangements, often self-organised. And the invention and the confidence of municipalism in these years is symbolised by people like Joseph Chamberlain, who, as leader of Birmingham Council, municipalised the gasworks and the water supply in the 19th century. And in London, where the county council, in what was a revolutionary idea for its time, began providing public housing. Local government was pace-setting. Now skip forward to the mid-20th century, the creation of the welfare state as we know it. There was much promise. A new government with 3 cabinet members who'd been councillors: Herbert Morrison, Clement Attlee and Iron Bevan. Debates about the role of central versus local government raged over these years. The historian Jerry White gave a talk to an LGIU audience a few years ago about this, in which he recounted the battles over healthcare in particular. It was originally planned that universal healthcare would be a function of local authorities. Local authorities already administered a large number of hospitals. Of the 55,000 beds in London, 40,000 were administered by local government. But Bevan became convinced that a centrally run National Health Service was the way forward. And nationalisation of utilities and centralisation of policy in many other areas continued apace. And at this time, we can see a very clear change in the relationship, a shift in power in Britain, as local government became increasingly a delivery agent of the central state. It wasn't that central government didn't like local government or see its uses. On the contrary, they wanted to use it to their own ends, to deliver their policies. So whilst local government's role expanded in these times to areas like social housing and social services, it was at the behest of central government. Now let's skip forward again via the major local government structural reforms of the 1970s that are still very much with us today, the constraints imposed on councils in the 1980s, like rate capping, the performance management system of the 1990s and the past decade. Top-downism prevailed. And it's no coincidence that over this period, we see a general decline in turnout at local elections and local politics being viewed in the shadow of what's happening in Westminster. And so today we have one of the most centralised systems of government anywhere in the world. And I believe that we're at a crossroads. And when you compare localism to lots of other isms, you'll find it is a newish concept. It's in some respects a philosophical response to globalism and centralism. And as national and supranational forces have grown stronger from big government to big business, localism urges us to think much more about the local. As I've said, society has organised at the local level since time began. Many of the exhibits here at the British Museum tell that story. The Saxon finds that are on display here from my own hometown tell that story of the evolution of local community. Local wasn't an ism because it was just how things were done. Now, I'm not able to say when and how globalism became such a powerful force. I'm certainly not qualified to do that. I guess we could trace it back to early explorers, to trade routes, to colonialism, to the empire. There's much to recommend larger forces of cooperation, whether that's across the nation or across the globe. The sharing of ideas, the sharing of cultures, the sharing of trade, the sharing of resources. These are, on the whole, positive forces. Yet as the world that we live in has grown richer in so many ways, as we've been empowered by global communication and global travel and global trade, in other ways we've become less powerful. Our connection with our neighbours is not as strong today as it's been at any time in history. A recent study by researchers at Sheffield University found that communities in Britain are significantly more fragmented and provide a lower sense of belonging than 40 years ago. What's more, as the work by my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Carr-West, who synthesised a range of studies on this, shows, the level and quality of social capital is changing for the worse. Does that matter? It matters hugely. Social capital strongly influences people's health, educational performance, the crime rate in an area, the socio-economic inequality in an area. And I think there is a relationship between globalisation and this decline of traditional community. Our willingness to look out for our neighbours has in some ways been diminished by the strong sense that all the people of the world are now our neighbours. You know, I heard this week on the radio the Prime Minister was in Pakistan offering to give £650 million to support education there. And my ears pricked up. £650 million. What about the cuts in British public services? But we can all understand, I'm sure we can, why this kind of internationalism is good for us, for our families, for our communities, why it makes a safer, stronger, more prosperous world. But as well as that shared destiny that we recognise that we do have with people the other side of the world, what about the people in our street and our town? It's good that we understand that we share our planet with other people, that we understand the opportunities that presents and the challenges, the melting of polar ice caps or the wars in foreign land or the economic turmoil of distant nations or even those closer to home like Portugal this week looking for a bailout. But we must also do much more to understand the opportunities and challenges within our local communities and how the local and the global are connected. It's not as if we can choose not to. Global influences are on our own doorstep. Most people, most of the time, embrace that. It brings variety, diversity, and invention. But for some, it can cause fear, uncertainty, resentment. In his very infamous encounter with Gillian Duffy, Gordon Brown showed he didn't quite understand that concern. When our labour may be underemployed or devalued by people from far away, producing goods in distant places at prices that we can't compete with, or offering labour in our communities at a wage we feel we can't live off, and accessing services, our services, like health and housing, in a way that people feel may not be fair, may not be right, and may in some way harm them. And we can trace all of that back to the problems of other people, which are essentially about how we live together with our near neighbours. Because being part of a society is not altogether an altruistic thing. Cooperating with others, the forces of cooperation with others, through neighbourliness, through community, through trade, through government, is generally better for all of us. But when we feel that our cooperation isn't working for us, it can be alienating. We must recognise that for all that cooperation on a national and global scale can enrich us, in some ways it can undermine the things we hold most dear: our identity, our power as citizens to shape our own lives, our ability to shape our destiny. And I think that is the biggest challenge facing us in the 21st century in Britain. How to adjust to being citizens of a fast-changing and intimately interconnected world. Abraham Lincoln said, "I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis." And I think the truth is daunting, that the old way of doing things needs to give way now. The world is shrinking. The pace of technological, scientific, medical development is absolutely astonishing. People are living longer and differently. Our climate is changing, whatever the cause of our response. And these are complex challenges that can only be met by collaboration, by pooling our creativity and our intelligence and responding through collective action. And so to the present and the practical. What are we going to do about it? What kind of collective action do we need? In short, I think we should return power to communities and strengthen civil society. The local government we've known, certainly that I've known through my working life, has been subject to thousands of statutory duties imposed by central government, has been operating within a tightly constrained legal and financial framework, has been audited and inspected to the nth degree around priorities driven by central government through a targets culture. It's no exaggeration, indeed it's widely said, including by current ministers and by people like Clive Betts, who's joined us tonight, whose select committee looked into this, that we do have one of the most centralised systems of government anywhere in the world. Decisions about local healthcare in your community are made too often and too much in Richmond House in Whitehall. If my child doesn't get into the school that he and I want him to go to, who can I complain to? Who can I ask for help? The Secretary of State for Education, Sanctuary Buildings, Whitehall. Our criminal justice policy, our prisons, our police service, all largely run from Whitehall. Transport policy, environment policy, even local government policy, largely run from Whitehall. And what's the effect of all that? Too little innovation, too much emphasis on standardised approaches rather than meeting the very different needs of communities and individuals. The novelist E.M. Forster praised democracy because he said it admits variety and it permits criticism. Well, my criticism is that our democracy does not admit enough variety. It's too far removed from us, operating too often at the wrong spatial level. Now, calling for greater local variety in government services is, of course, controversial. Some call it the postcode lottery. The tabloids love that term. I call it local diversity. Some of you may have heard Eric Pickles speaking last year at an LGIU event. He said he's got 3 priorities. You've heard this. Localism, localism, and my third priority, localism. He's introduced the Localism and Decentralisation Bill alongside a major change in the resources for local government. For some councils, a reduction of up to 30% or more. Now, each of these things, the legislative initiatives, the funding changes, will have a big impact on councils and communities. But together, I predict, and I doubt many of you will disagree, that they'll lead to unprecedented change in our public services.